Welcome to the Beehive, and thank you for joining us, you bumblebees. And today we have a really cool show about some engine builders, early day Speedway. But first, if you like this video, go ahead and like it at the bottom, and we really appreciate it. Thank you so much for joining us today. We have Bebop. Bebop's hanging out. She's probably going to dance for. I'm going to try to do this show with Bebop not yelling too much, but I don't know if that's going to happen. So anyways, today we're going to talk about some engine builders of early day Speedway history. And they were really good. They made the bikes fast, and they made world champions and United States champions. So these guys were really good. They were awesome. So we're going to talk about them. And who are they? Dancing Bird. No, it's not the Dancing Bird. It is Ed Shaffer of Speedway Research and George Wynn, an immigrant from the UK. He moved to America, and he was part of Speedway history in the early days. Both were amazing engine builders, tuners. These guys were good. So we're going to talk about them today. And they had amazing minds. They knew like everything about the Speedway bike. And so Ed Shaffer was he was a genius mind. There was a lot of them. There was a few early day genius minds, and we've talked about one of them in particular, and we're going to talk about a couple more today. And he actually was an elderly gentleman when I got to know him in the 70s, and he was the owner of the Speedway Research. It was in Costa Mesa, California. It was off of the 55 freeway and MacArthur Boulevard, and it was just off of MacArthur there. And he just went ahead and had this beautiful shop over there. And it was the first building when you arrived there. I remember that. And he was a sponsor of a young rider who was number 2 and number 1 named Rick Woods. And Ed was really an amazing engine builder. And he actually built a couple of Rick Woods' United States Championship bikes. So Ed Shaffer definitely knew how to make the engines go fast. I remember watching Rick Woods on an Ed Shaffer engine, and Rick Woods was fast. Those engines were amazing. So that was early day tuner of Ed Shaffer. And actually, there was in those days, there was 2-valve Speedway bikes. We'll get Bebop back here. There's 2 valves. And then Ed Shaffer sort of got the Speedway going with a 4-valve conversion kit. Ed Shaffer had his own little conversion kit. They wanted to make the bikes go faster, and they wanted to advance the technology. And that's exactly what Ed did. He went ahead and made the 4-valve conversion kit from the 2-valve Jawa engines. And he made one of the first ones that I know of. They were $750 if you wanted to buy it. And then it would be like in pieces, I guess. And then hopefully he would install it for you, because I'm sure nobody knew how to install it. And Gene Woods was on the show last week, and Gene Woods was showing me his 4-valve conversion kit, his Ed Shaffer Speedway Research 4-valve conversion kit, and it was really nice. And Gene Woods has it proudly displayed in his office. So if you want to go see one, you just go see Gene Woods, and he will show you his 4-valve conversion kit from Ed Shaffer. It was one of the first 4-valve conversion kits before 4 valves even came to Speedway. And Ed Shaffer was inventing that 4-valve, and a couple other guys were doing it too, but Ed Shaffer was one of the first ones to go ahead and advance the 4 valves from the 2-valve Speedway engines. So that was really neat. And it required no machine work and to install. It was like a cylinder head with guides. It had the valve guides, the valve seats, rocker arms. It included that, the valve intake and the valve exhaust sleeves, the guides, the rocker arms, the bearings, the valve cover. It took another valve cover for that 4-valve. It wasn't like the normal. You had to actually change the valve cover, the head section. And also the push rod tubes in the seat. And all that was for $750 back a long time ago. It was probably like $2,000 today, but back then it was $750. It was like in 1977 was when his manual came out. So anyways, one day a 16-year-old Speedway rider named me, I went ahead and I wanted to see what was going on over the Speedway research. And I went ahead and drove my car. I could drive at 16, and I drove my car over to Ed's shop over there. And I went ahead and knocked on Ed's door, and he opened the door and he said, "Who is this?" And I said, "I'm Brian, and I'm like a 16-year-old Speedway rider, and I want to see your shop." I knew he was a sponsor of Rick Woods, and I knew he was kind of a genius in Speedway history, so I wanted to like see what he was doing in his shop, and I wanted to investigate because no one would ever invite me, so I had to go knocking on his door like, "Hi Ed, it's me." And he's like, "Who are you?" And I said, "I'm Brian. Yesterday I did that with Sonny Nutter. I went to Sonny Nutter's party," and I'm like walking in. Sonny's like, "Who are you?" And I said, "I'm Brian. Don't you know me?" And he's like, "No, get out of my party." And I did the same with Ed. I had a lot of courage, I guess, and I was really curious. You know, I wasn't just sitting back and just letting things happen. I wanted to see for myself what was happening. And I went to Ed's shop, and it was amazing what I saw. And it just was a great shop. It was like, first thing I saw was Rick Woods' beautiful Speedway bike. It was beautiful. It was sitting up on like a stand. Ed was working on it for the Speedway race for Costa Mesa that Friday night. And it was gorgeous. You know, it was clean. Ed had the whole head off. He was adjusting the valves, and he was doing all this work to Rick Woods' Speedway bike. And I thought that was really great, you know, like just looking at it. And then I looked around the whole shop, Ed's shop, and it was beautiful. It was really gorgeous. It was like clean, and the floors were shiny, and it was all beautiful. It was like if you go to a hospital, it was like being in a hospital office where the doctors are. And then I looked at Ed, and he wore a white doctor's coat, and I said, "This is like a hospital." I mean, everything was, there was no germs, everything was perfect, and he was like clean and perfect, and he was a gentleman, Ed Shaffer. He was a nice guy. He allowed me into his shop, and I just told him, "I want to see what you're doing here because you're a pretty cool guy," and he was a pretty cool guy, and he let me in his shop. Sonny Nutter didn't let me in his party, but Ed Shaffer let me in his shop, so I like that. It was very cool. And actually, I was amazed at how beautiful. That was the most beautiful workshop I've ever seen in my life. As a young 16-year-old Speedway rider, I really liked it. Ed Shaffer was like cool, and he really was awesome. So he had his total cleanliness award for the year. I mean, he was perfect. And Ed was the reason why Rick Woods won those 2 championships in 70 and 72. I think when he won his first championship in 1968, I don't think Ed Shaffer was with Rick Woods that I know of. He might have been, but I don't think so. And so we know that Rick Woods won at least 2 championships, United States championships with Ed Shaffer, which, you know, I mean, his bikes were fast. I mean, Ed Shaffer was amazing. So that was kind of the reason why Rick Woods won. Of course, Rick Woods is he's a great Speedway rider. So if you get a great Speedway rider and then you get a great mechanic, and then you have like a double, you know, you have a good rider and then you have a good engine and you win the United States Championship. And that's exactly what the Rocket Rick Woods did in 70 and 72 on the Ed Shaffer Speedway research engine. They were amazing machines and fast. So that was cool. Ed Shaffer was really good. And like I say, Ed was a nice older guy. He was a mild manner. He was a thin guy. He was calm. He talked real quietly. I talk kind of loud, but Ed Shaffer was kind of like quiet, you know, sweet man. He was like a genius guy. He didn't talk a lot. When I knocked on the door, he's like, "What do you want?" I said, "I want to see your shop. Can I see it?" And he's like, "Let me think." And I said, "Please, I want to see your shop." He was a nice man. He let me in, so that was cool. And so, and then all of a sudden, just suddenly, like shortly afterwards, maybe a year or so after I went to his shop, and so he just passed away of a heart attack. He just suddenly like died suddenly. And you wouldn't think that Ed Shaffer would die of a heart attack because he was a thin guy. He didn't seem to be stressed out. He must have been stressed. But he was a good guy, and he just didn't seem like he would die of a heart attack. And he was in relatively good health, and all of a sudden, boom, he passed away. So that shows you that life is fragile and it can pass at any time. Ed Shaffer taught me that lesson because I didn't think he was going to pass away, and boom, he was gone. And before his passing, though, Ed Shaffer built maybe one of the first junior speedway bikes. Gene Woods was telling me how Ed Shaffer built his speedway bike for him. If you look on the cover of this particular video, you see a young speedway rider, and then you see a older speedway rider. That's Gene Woods, the younger speedway rider. He doesn't look like that now. He looks old. But back in that cover, he looked like young because he was like 8 years old or 10 years old. And his brother, Rick Woods, was like 18 or 20 years old. And that's Ed Shaffer on the cover of this video. He's adjusting the machine, and Rick Woods is adjusting Gene's helmet. They're like, okay, little boy, you can ride this thing. Gene Woods could ride that thing, and he was good. But, everybody starts somewhere, and Ed Shaffer started Gene Woods in his first junior speedway races. He built that bike at the Speedway Research. He was a genius. Like I say, I think Ed Shaffer, as far as I know, I may be wrong, he invented and built the first junior speedway bikes of all time that we know of. And so I may be wrong, but I don't know of anybody who built the junior speedway bikes before Ed Shaffer. So Ed Shaffer goes down as the credit of building the first speedway bikes, the junior speedway bikes. So that was really great. And it was all because of Ed Shaffer. And then I was talking to Dennis Sigalos. Siggy was in the house. Do you know Dennis Sigalos? He's a good writer. And he was a legend also with Gene Woods. They're both amazing. And Siggy told me that, I think it was Ed Shaffer, if I'm not mistaken, he built his first speedway bike a little before, after Gene Woods. He built a speedway bike, and then Bruce Penhall, possibly Ed Shaffer, built his speedway bike too. So Ed Shaffer was involved with Rick Woods, and Ed Shaffer, Rick Woods' dad sponsored Rick Woods, and so it was like a connection. They're all connected. Like Penhall and Sigalos' dad sponsored Rick Woods, and Rick Woods knew Ed Shaffer, and then Ed Shaffer built the bikes for the guys. It was like a happy family. Like everybody knew each other. They were all like good friends. So Ed Shaffer probably built that first speedway bike for the two-time world champion Bruce Penhall and the amazing, amazing British League rider champion Dennis Sigalos and the champion Gene Woods. So Ed Shaffer did a lot of cool stuff in the early day junior speedway ranks, and he built those engines. So we credit Ed Shaffer for that. So that was really cool that Ed went ahead and did that. So and so anyways, like I said, he had passed away, and all the stuff that Ed had, like that beautiful shop and all the things Ed had, it just like disappeared because he was renting that building over there off of MacArthur, and then it's like Bristol Street or something. And then after he passed away, I guess his family took all the stuff, and then suddenly, like the note, it was gone. Like everything disappeared, and that was the end we heard of Ed Shaffer. I tried looking on like the internet for pictures of Ed Shaffer, and I have that picture of Ed working on Gene Woods' bike in the cover here, the thumbnail, but you can't find a picture of Ed Shaffer or George Wynn anywhere. I looked on the internet, and I wish I took pictures of these guys because you can't find these guys like anywhere. So that's really sad that you can't like see these guys, and you can't see pictures of them. They're like invisible in the history. Like you maybe never see them again, except for right here. We like to talk about these people because we don't want to forget about them, because they were really instrumental in the early day Speedway success and history. And it's really important that we talk about these people so we remember them because they were very special engine builders. They made those Speedway riders go fast. And so we must give them credit because I was a rider also, and I didn't know how to work on engines. I mean, I admit I was crappy. You know, I had no idea. So I needed that tuner to make me go fast because if it was me doing the tuning, I would go slow. So we have to credit these engine builders because they are the reason why we have success. So that's the reason why we're doing this show, is to give the honor and homage to Ed Shaffer and George Wynn. They were just really great engine builders, and they were great human beings as well. So we move over to the next guy. That's the last I heard of Ed Shaffer. You know, I mean, there was like, he was gone, and that was it for Ed. And we say, rest in peace, Ed Shaffer, because we really love that guy, and he was nice to me too, so I appreciate that. And then next we move on to George Wynn. George, do you remember George Wynn? Do you know that guy? He was a good old guy, and we knew George when he was kind of getting old. You know, he was like towards his last part of his life, and he was great. He was old guy. He was born in like 1920 in England. He was an old Englishman and like a genius guy too, like Ed Shaffer. They're both like the same. They're both really smart. And George got his start at Speedway in 1948. He was, Dickie Wise, this manager promoter, asked George to replace the tuner, Wolfie Lucy, to work on Paddy Mills' motorcycle in the British League in Norwich, on the Norwich Speedway team. And George Wynn said, okay, I will do it, in his British accent. He's a good old guy. He was a young guy back in 1948, by the way. He was only, what, 20 years old, 22 years old. He got his start in Speedway when he was just in his early 20s. So that's why he was so good. He was in for many years in developing and stuff. And we're going to talk about that. So he went ahead and he then built a track for Ole Funden. He built a Speedway practice track. And I heard that goes ahead and he practices on that track. He's on Facebook, I saw. He must be old now. I mean, that guy is old. And he was a great rider. He was a world champion, and he was just an amazing rider. And I sent him a friend request, and he never accepted it. So he thought, who is this guy? I don't know him like Ed Shaffer and like Sonny Nutter. They don't know me. So they're like, oh, go away. So I liked that guy, and George built his practice track for him. And then and later, I was talking again to Dennis Sigalos, and he said that George Wynn, I think he built his practice track for Siggy and Penhall, and he built the starting gates. You know, the starting gates. I mean, those guys were cool. They had starting gates for their Speedway track. So when they practiced the Speedway, they had actually the tapes and the starting gates. So I can now picture Bruce Penhall and Dennis Sigalos lining up, you know, like this, and then the race started, and Dennis Sigalos and Bruce Penhall racing. I asked Dennis, like, who won your races between you and Bruce? Like, who is the better junior rider, you or Bruce? And then Dennis is like, I said, who won the most races? Because that was a good question. Like, these guys rode all the time, Dennis Sigalos and Bruce Penhall. So I was like, when they were like 12 years old and little kids, little rugrats. And I said, like, who won, like, those races between you and Bruce? I want to know. Inquiring minds want to know, like, who won those races? That would be a good question. And I asked it. And then Dennis was like, you know, Dennis is a good guy. And he's like, well, I think Bruce won more. Well, Bruce Penhall is good, right? So I could just picture like Dennis Sigalos and Bruce Penhall like racing around this little track. It was a track, I guess it was in Anaheim, behind Sigalos' dad's catering business. They built this Speedway track, and then every weekend Dennis and Bruce would be out there practicing on the George Wynn gates, you know. And then also they built, I guess George probably helped build the crash walls. That's what I think I heard. And the Speedway track, everything. George Wynn was an early part of Bruce Penhall, Dennis Tagalos, and Gene Woods, and Rick Woods, and many other Speedway greats. So Ed Shaffer and George Wynn were really amazing guys. That's why we're doing the show today, because we like them, and they were special guys in the Speedway history. So moving along, that in 1952, George and his wife, Frida, do you remember Frida? We're going to talk about her, the red-headed lady, the little lady from England with the big mouth. We're going to talk about her in a second. But they went ahead and moved to Canada. They migrated from England, UK, to Canada in 1952. And then in 1956, George tuned the Triumph bikes for the Canadian National Road Racers. George was into the road racing over there in Canada. I guess they had no Speedway that much at the time. So George took anything he could get, and it was the road racing. He was an expert at engines, like anything. He could tune those Triumph bikes, road racers, TTs, anything. George Wynn was a genius mind, as well as Ed Shaffer. So they were really great. And then in 1962, George and Frida, they immigrated to Anaheim, California, next to Disneyland, close to Disneyland. Do you know where Anaheim, California is? It's next to my birthplace in Orange. And it was really nice that he lived there. George lived there the rest of his life. I went to his house once, and it was like a little like apartment or something. I don't know. It was just on this little road in Anaheim. It wasn't anything special per se, simple, normal. And George Wynn just was a simple guy. You know, he wasn't flashy. He didn't have to live in a mansion. He just lived in a little house or a little like apartment. I forgot what it was, but it was a long time ago. But it was just a simple place, that George Wynn and Frida. And they lived there their whole life, you know, until he passed away. So they lived there like 40 or 50 years he had lived there. Let's see, 60, 70. He lived there 40 years, over 40 years. So George Wynn was there for the rest of his life. And now Ed Shaffer, he worked out of this beautiful garage. I mean, Ed Shaffer, he like had this beautiful garage and stuff, and it was perfectly clean. It was like a hospital, and it was really great. And then George Wynn was like just a free spirit. I mean, he like worked out of his house. I went there like in the 1990s to work on my bike, and he went ahead and he brought me out in the curb. He said, "Brian, just take your motorcycle and stick it out by the road and we'll work on it on the sidewalk." And I'm like, "Oh, okay." So George was really nothing like Ed Shaffer. I mean, he just worked on anything. Like he would work on it in the pits. He'd work on it in the street and the sidewalk. I mean, it didn't matter to George. I mean, he just like opened your motorcycle and worked on it. He was old time and old school, and he was a pretty nice guy. I liked him a lot. And so he worked on my bike on the street. I just took the bike out of my van and he just started working on it right there. I was like, oh, there's no Ed Shaffer workshop here. It's just like open air, you know. And it was cool. So, anyways, like I say, I was at his shop and house. He didn't have a shop in the 90s, and he just opened up it was a Westlake I rode at that time, and he just started working on it, and he made it go pretty good. But going back to 1963, George, he ran an Ariel 500. I guess it was a Triumph, but I'm not sure. And it was a single-cylinder Triumph, I think, the Ariel. And he took the parts off the JAP Speedway bike, and he kind of like mixed up the parts inside the single-cylinder TT track. They rode at Ascot, and he built this for one of the riders. And then the riders went ahead and he was racing the twin cylinders, and they're supposed to be faster than the one single cylinder. And George Wynn's bike with the JAP parts was beating the twin cylinders. So everybody was like, how did that happen? How did George Wynn like do all this stuff? And, you know, it was just amazing. So George Wynn went ahead and built this name for himself by beating the twin cylinders with a single cylinder because he was genius. He used these parts and he was winning those races at Ascot on his single cylinder engine. So that was really cool. And the riders really liked George Wynn, and his name became bigger and bigger because he was smart. So he also, when the SRA came into existence, George also worked for that, the SRA, and he worked for Harry Oxley at the Costa Mesa Speedway. George, excuse me, was the first manager at the Costa Mesa Speedway for Harry Oxley. And he was like he ran the whole show. George Wynn was the original manager and runner of the Costa Mesa Speedway. And I guess George needed some help, you know, as far as with his thing. So he hired Frida Wynn to run the back gate. Do you remember Frida Wynn? We're going to talk about her right now. Frida was an older lady, small. She was a redhead. She had brilliant red hair, like flames, like a fire. And then her personality was like a fireball. Frida was really like, you know, she was like loudmouth and, all right, you guys, get over here. I'm Frida Wynn, you know. She was cool. She was scary. I was so intimidated by this little British lady. She was like yelling at people. She would yell at the top rider. She'd say like, Rick Woods, get over here, and I want you to come here and talk to me. I'm mad at you. And I'm like, oh, she's yelling at Rick Woods. She was pretty amazing little old lady. And you don't get on the wrong side of Frida. If you get on the wrong side of Frida, you are in trouble. So I was scared. I was a shy 16-year-old. You know, I was like happy to be there and stuff. So I would always go up to Frida like, hi, Frida, I'm nice. And, you know, I was like kissing her butt because I knew if you got on the wrong side of Frida, you were in trouble. So I went ahead and I was a sweet guy when it comes to Frida Wynn. And she was nice to me. She never yelled at me. She yelled at me one time and I said, Frida, I'm your friend, remember? And she said, oh, yeah, okay. And then she was nice to me. So I love that old lady, Frida, and she was really cool. And then George went ahead, like I say, he worked for the SRA. So he was the manager of Harry Oxley for the Costa Mesa Speedway. And at the same time, he worked for the SRA. At that time, Jerry Fairchild was the president of the SRA. And I guess Jerry hired George to write the rule book for the SRA. So George probably took a couple months or something. He wrote this big, thick rule book. And a lot of these rules exist today. And the SRA always enforced those rules. They lived by the rules like it was like the Bible. And, you know, they had lots of things in that rule book, like what kind of engine you can run, what kind of tires you can run, all the specifications, all the rules and regulations. I mean, it was a thick book of rules, and I didn't like that many rules, and also George wrote a bunch of fines, you know, like if you have a violation, you have to pay a fine, like a ticket. And he had a bunch of fines. I didn't like that one. And one day when I was riding in like D3, my throttle stuck wide open and they had to pull the spark plug up. And then George Wynn came up to me and said, Brian, I have a ticket for you. And I said, what? I'm a D3 rider. And he said, your throttle stuck wide open and now you must pay $25. And I'm like, what? That's BS. And I had to pay $25. It's like $100 now, and I was mad because, you know, all these rules and regulations. I think George could have kept some of those rules and regulations, especially the sticking of the throttle. I didn't know better, and, you know, it wasn't my fault. But anyways, we won't talk about that. I'm mad. No, I'm not mad. That was a long time ago, so I'm cool with it. So anyways, he did the rule book, and he violated me, and also, one of the cool things that George Wynn did was he worked with Ivan Major. Do you remember who Ivan Major was? He's passed away, rest in peace, Ivan Major. Ivan Major won 2 world championships, and George Wynn was tuning those bikes. And they were good friends. And George Wynn went up to Ivan Major after his 2nd world championship, and he told Ivan, he said, hey, if you win 1 more world championship in a row, if you repeat 3 times, if you get, what's it called, the triple crown of Speedway, you win 3 world championships back to back to back, I will take that Speedway bike and I will go ahead and make it gold. I will plate your Speedway bike, your world championship winning Speedway bike. I will make it all gold. And Ivan's like, okay, we'll try that. And of course, if you tell Ivan, you know, you're going to do something like that, he's going to win. And guess what? Ivan won that 3rd world championship in a row. And Ivan's like, okay, George, here's my bike. And so Ivan went ahead and gave that bike. And there was a guy named Ray Bokerman, and they went ahead with George and they gold plated that motorcycle. So that beautiful 3-time Speedway World Championship Speedway bike was actually all pure gold plated. It was gorgeous. I saw that before and I'm like, what is this? Because I had no idea what the history was. And if you study Ivan Major and his history, they will always talk about this. So George Wynn kind of goes down in history with Ivan Major for gold plating his 3rd world championship bike in a row. And it's just really cool. So the history of Ivan Major is attached to George Wynn in that way. So, and also the bike was given back to Ivan when he was alive, and Ivan proudly had that. It was gorgeous, took pictures of it. I have seen a lot of pictures. And then when Ivan passed away, perhaps his family went ahead and donated that beautiful gold Speedway bike to a museum in Christchurch, New Zealand. And today, if you want to see that gold-plated bike, you must go to Christchurch, New Zealand, and you can see that bike. So it's there today in Christchurch. There's a museum there, and it's just waiting for you to go look at that beautiful gold bike that George went ahead and gold-plated. It was in the United States, and then he sent the bike back to Ivan in Europe somewhere, or Australia. I'm not sure where he was at the time, but he got that bike anyways. And George went ahead, and he was like an expert on the Westlake engines. George knew everything about the Westlake. So if you had a Westlake Speedway bike, Steve Bass rode the first Westlake Speedway bike, and then everybody had a Westlake. Penhall was sponsored by Westlake. Everybody rode Westlake after the Jawas. And George was a master mechanic, a tuner, engine builder of the Westlake. That was kind of his fame. George was connected to the Westlake motors, and he just knew everything. I took my Westlake to George because I knew he was a Westlake guru, and he went ahead. He did so many engines that there's a valve, there's a head cover for the head of the where the valves are. And George went ahead and took the Westlake valve cover off, and he had a custom machine valve cover that said Wynn, W-E-N-N. So you can win the races, or win with George Wynn. I'm not sure how you win, but you win. And all these Westlakes had that cover on it. Every time I would see a Westlake, it said Wynn on the head. You can see it in red. And I was like, that's George Wynn's cover. So George Wynn went ahead and replaced a lot of these Westlakes with the Wynn cover. So that was cool. All these guys were putting their names all over their engines, and George was no different. She's biting my hat, so I don't know if I like that one. So that was really cool. And then George worked on Speedway engines for his entire life. I mean, George was like, he just loved working on engines. That was his passion. That was his life. And sadly, in 2002, George passed away and left his beloved wife, Frida. And we sorely miss George Wynn, because George really had a special place in the Speedway history. And he was really a nice guy. And his wife, Frida, lived a few more years, and then she passed away. So it was really sad that we lost Frida. and George. And like I say, I miss Frida's like yelling and stuff. She had a big mouth and she was cool. So Frida was really nice, and to me she was nice. To other people she was mean, and they went ahead and they were just nice people, and they went ahead and wore. George Wynn wore this white beanie, this bell helmet, like the old time. I think I have a picture of that on the cover of this. Over Jerry Fairchild was wearing one of those hats, and it said Bell helmets on the beanie. And then George always wore like a red windbreaker, like a Bell helmet windbreaker, red with some stripes on it with the insignia Bell helmets. And so they went ahead and did that. And then I only had a few experiences with George, to be honest with you. And one of the times was when I was racing for the match race championship in San Diego at the South Bay Speedway. Let's see, where is it? Right here. See that cup? I had won that cup, and I was racing the amazing United States champion, Brad Oxley, when he was younger, before his championship at the South Bay Speedway, Otay Mesa Speedway. And it came down to like a match race championship between me and Brad Oxley. And I remember I was like a feisty young guy. I was not quiet. I had a big mouth, and I do today. And I was there, and I did really well at that track. And it was the two match race champions squaring off for the final, for the winning that cup. And I wanted to win that cup because every week I would see that cup at sign-up booth, and I'd say, I want that cup. And every week I wanted that cup more and more and more. I was like, and so I ended up being like, me and Brad ran up for that cup. And then when the announcer said, Brian, could you come up to the announcer's booth and do a live intercom interview with me right before the match race? And I said, okay, I like to talk. So I'm like, okay. So I went up to the announcer's booth at the San Diego Speedway, and the announcer said, hey, Brian, you know, how do you think you're going to do tonight? You're going to race Brad Oxley next. And I was just a like 17-year-old kid, you know. I was kind of like, you know, I was kind of different. And so I grabbed the microphone and I said, yeah, you know, I'm excited about racing Brad, you know, like, I'm really going to beat him tonight. Like, he better get ready to lose because I'm going to take him down. So, and everyone's like, ah! And I should have just been more nice. I should have said, Brad's a good racer and he may beat me and I may beat him. I don't know. But I said, I'm going to beat Brad. And so I saw Harry Oxley, his eyes, you know, and then Brad was like, oh. And then George Wynn was with Brad because he was Brad's tuner at the time. And they were together in the pits, and then George Wynn was really like mad at me. He's like, I don't like that guy. He has a big mouth. Brad, go beat him. Go beat him. He didn't like me, and Harry Oxley I think didn't like me either, but I didn't care. I always wanted to win that cup. I don't give a crap, man. And I went ahead and won that cup wherever it is. Bebop's hiding it over there. And so I went ahead and won that cup because I wanted it a lot. And Brad, you know, Brad was a good rider, and, you know, he won like a couple of United States championships later on. So Brad was a hard rider to beat. He was no easy guy. And, you know, when you race like that, you have to give it all you have, you know, and you'd be lucky if you win. And I got lucky wherever it is right there, and I won that cup. And then George Wynn was really kind of mad, you know, that I won. I beat his guy. I saw Brad and George Wynn, actually, that night, I never said this story before. That night, we were coming home from San Diego, and Brad lives in San Clemente, California, and we stopped in San Clemente to eat breakfast. It was like late in the morning, you know, because it was far and it was late and stuff. It was like 2 o'clock in the morning or whatever it was by the time we got there from San Diego. And we pulled into like a Denny's restaurant, and we go there, and then the waitress sits us at the Denny's. I had just beat Brad Oxley for that cup, and then they went ahead and put us in this booth, and I look at the next booth, and there's Brad Oxley, Harry Oxley, and George Wynn eating breakfast, and I had just beat Brad, and they're all mad at me, and I'm like, hi. And they're like, I'm going to kill you. You beat Brad Oxley. I was laughing my butt off. I'm like, oh my gosh, we got George Wynn, Harry Oxley, and Brad Oxley like right next to me. We were eating right now. How uncomfortable was that? Like, we were like looking at each other like, hi, hi. That was funny. I never said that story before, but that's true. And it happened at Denny's in like San Clemente on the way home from that races that night. So that was cool. And so anyways, it's sad that George Wynn and Ed Shaffer took all this knowledge with them to the grave because these guys were really genius. They learned a lot and then boom, all that knowledge is gone. It's kind of sad. And, we're sad that both those guys had passed away. And so we're going ahead and honor those guys because they really had a big part in the Speedway history. And they deserved some recognition because they what made the Speedway bikes go fast. They made champions, world champions, United States champions. These guys were really a big part because us motorcycle riders don't really know how to fix the bikes really good, and Cloutier especially. So we need those mechanics. And so that's why we honor them because without them, we are nothing. And so we appreciate them so much. And so anyways, thank you so much for watching the live stream, and go ahead and like if you like this show. She's biting my hat. I don't like that one. And we're going to have Mike Faria on the show here soon, maybe the next day or so, Flying Mike Faria. Do you know Flying Mike Faria, number 9, number 1? He's an amazing rider. And hopefully we're going to get him on the show soon. And it's going to be next, I think. So we're going to work that out with him. And thank you for watching. We appreciate that. And thanks for your support. We want to see the sport of Speedway grow, and we're really happy to be doing these live stream shows with you. So if you want to like and subscribe, that would be great. And thank you so much again for watching, and have a great day. And we appreciate George Wynn and Ed Shaffer for all they've done for Speedway. So thanks a lot. Take care. Have a